Ladies and gentlemen, hear this clearly. Every relationship you enter is governed by a purpose. It is not accidental, it is not random, and it is not without structure. There is always an exchange of energy, of value, of influence. And when that exchange becomes distorted, the relationship itself begins to collapse. Now understand this principle because it is critical to your growth. No relationship can survive where there is imbalance without consequence. Every relationship you enter operates on a foundation, whether you recognize it or not. It is not sustained by emotions alone, and it certainly cannot survive on intentions that lack clarity. At its core, a relationship is built on purpose. The reason two individuals are connected, the value they exchange, and the direction they are meant to move in together. When purpose is absent or misunderstood, what remains is often confusion, imbalance, and eventually dysfunction. You must understand that purpose gives structure. It defines roles, establishes expectations, and creates alignment. Without it, people begin to rely on feelings as their primary guide, and feelings by nature are inconsistent. One moment they are strong, the next they are uncertain. So when a relationship is driven only by emotion, it becomes unstable. But when it is grounded in purpose, it gains direction and sustainability. Now consider what happens when control replaces purpose. Control is not about mutual growth, it is about dominance. It seeks to direct, to manipulate, and to maintain power over the other person. And the moment control enters a relationship, purpose begins to fade. Because you cannot grow together when one person is trying to govern the other. Growth requires cooperation, not control. It requires respect, not domination. In a healthy connection, both individuals understand their value, and they bring that value into the relationships. There is an exchange, support for support, respect for respect, growth for growth. It is not about perfection, it is about balance. But when one person begins to take more than they give, or give only to maintain influence, the relationship shifts from being purposeful to being transactional or even exploitative. This is where many people become confused, especially those who naturally give more of themselves. They believe that the more they invest, the stronger the relationship becomes. But investment without alignment does not produce strength, it produces depletion. Because if the other person is not contributing in a meaningful and healthy way, then what you are building is not a partnership. It is a one-sided structure that cannot sustain itself. Purpose also protects identity. When you know why you are in a relationship, you are less likely to lose yourself within it. You are able to maintain your values, your boundaries, and your sense of direction. But when purpose is unclear, people often begin to adapt themselves just to maintain the connection. They compromise their standards, ignore red flags, and silence their intuition, all in an effort to keep something that was never stable to begin with. And this is the danger of relationships built on control rather than purpose. Control demands that you shrink so that someone else can feel larger. It pressures you to conform rather than to grow. It rewards compliance instead of authenticity. And over time, it erodes your sense of self. But purpose does the opposite. Purpose expands you. It challenges you to become better, not smaller. It encourages honesty, not fear. It creates an environment where both individuals can evolve without losing who they are. That is the difference between a relationship that builds you and one that drains you. Another critical aspect to understand is that purpose is not always revealed immediately. It often becomes clearer over time through interaction, communication, and shared experiences. However, there must be a willingness from both individuals to seek that clarity. Without that effort, assumptions take over, and assumptions are often inaccurate. They create expectations that were never agreed upon, leading to disappointment and conflict. When purpose is aligned, there is a sense of direction. Decisions become easier because both individuals are moving toward something meaningful. There is less confusion, less conflict, and more cooperation. But when purpose is absent or replaced by control, every decision becomes a struggle. There is tension instead of harmony, resistance instead of flow. You must also recognize that not every connection is meant to be permanent. Some relationships exist to teach, to reveal, and to redirect. And when their purpose is fulfilled, they naturally come to an end. Trying to force them beyond that point often leads to frustration and emotional strain. But when you understand purpose, you are able to release what no longer aligns without losing your sense of worth. So, the question you must ask yourself is not simply, do I feel something? But rather, is this connection aligned with my purpose? Because feelings can draw you in, but purpose determines whether you should remain. When you begin to prioritize purpose over control, everything changes. You become more intentional in your choices. You become more aware of what you accept and what you reject. And most importantly, you begin to build relationships that are not only meaningful, but also sustainable. Because at the end of the day, a relationship should not require you to lose yourself in order to keep it. It should support who you are becoming. And that is only possible when it is built on purpose, not control. There is a fundamental difference between giving and consuming. And if you do not understand this difference, you will misinterpret what is happening in your relationships. One operates from overflow, the other from deficiency. One is rooted in purpose, the other in need. And when these two dynamics meet without awareness, the result is not balance, it is depletion. An empath by nature is someone who feels deeply, connects easily, and responds with compassion. They do not just hear words, they sense emotions. They do not just observe behavior, they internalize experiences. This ability is not a weakness, it is a gift. It allows them to bring healing, understanding, and support into environments where those qualities are lacking. But every gift, if not managed with wisdom, can be misused, not only by others, but by the individual themselves. Now consider the other side of the equation. A narcissistic personality operates from a constant need for validation, control, and reinforcement of identity. Instead of giving from a place of wholeness, they seek to extract from others what they cannot sustain within themselves. Attention becomes their fuel. Admiration becomes their currency. Control becomes their method of security. And because this need is internal, it is never fully satisfied. So when these two individuals connect, there is an immediate and powerful exchange. The empath gives time, energy, patience, emotional support. The narcissist receives attention, validation, and influence. At first, it may feel like a strong bond. The empath feels needed. The narcissist feels empowered. But what appears to be connection is often a system of imbalance that slowly intensifies. You must understand this clearly. Anything that only flows in one direction will eventually create exhaustion. The empath begins to give more, thinking that more effort will produce stability. They become more understanding, more forgiving, more accommodating. They ignore red flags, justify harmful behavior, and minimize their own needs. Why? Because they are trying to preserve the connection. But preservation without reciprocity leads to self-neglect. At the same time, the narcissist becomes more dependent on that supply. Not emotionally connected, but functionally reliant. They expect the empathy. They assume the patience. They require the attention. And over time, what was once requested becomes demanded. This is where the real danger begins. Because the empath starts losing awareness of their own depletion. They may feel tired, but they push through. They may feel unappreciated, but they rationalize it. They may feel drained, but they continue giving. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to disconnect from themselves. Now listen carefully, because this is critical. You cannot pour endlessly without being refilled. Energy is not infinite at the human level. Emotional capacity is not limitless. And when you consistently give without receiving restoration, you are not being strong. You are being unsustainable. The narcissist, however, does not operate from this awareness because their focus is not mutual exchange. It is personal fulfillment. So they continue to take, not necessarily out of conscious malice in every moment, but out of an ingrained pattern of self-centered operation. And because the empath continues to give, the pattern is reinforced. This creates a cycle. The more the empath gives, the more the narcissist expects. The more the narcissist expects, the more the empath stretches themselves. And eventually, the empath reaches a breaking point. But here is what you must recognize. The breaking point is not failure, it is feedback. It is the system of your mind and spirit telling you that the current pattern is no longer sustainable. It is a signal that something must change, not externally first, but internally. Because the true issue is not only what the narcissist is doing, it is what the empath has allowed themselves to tolerate. And this is not about blame, it is about awareness. Awareness empowers change. When the empath begins to understand their own value, they start to see the imbalance clearly. They recognize that giving is not the problem, giving without boundaries is. They realize that compassion is not weakness, but compassion without discernment is vulnerability. And once this realization occurs, everything begins to shift. They stop overextending. They stop justifying harmful patterns. They stop abandoning themselves to maintain the connection. And in doing so, they interrupt the cycle. Now understand this, when the flow of energy changes, the entire relationship dynamic changes. The narcissist, who was accustomed to constant supply, begins to feel the absence. And because the relationship was built on consumption rather than mutual growth, it cannot function the same way anymore. This often leads to conflict, distance, or complete separation. But that outcome is not destruction, it is correction. Because any connection that depends on one person losing themselves so the other can feel complete is not a healthy connection. It is an imbalance that needed to be addressed. So the lesson here is not to stop being empathetic. The world needs empathy. The lesson is to align empathy with wisdom, to give, but not at the cost of yourself, to care, but not without boundaries, to support, but not without mutual respect. Because the goal is not to become less compassionate. The goal is to become consciously compassionate. And when you reach that level of awareness, you no longer enter relationships as a source to be consumed. You enter as a whole individual capable of both giving and receiving. That is balance. That is strength. That is growth. When a connection begins to break, most people focus on the pain of separation. But very few take the time to understand what the separation is revealing. And that is where the real lesson exists. Because the ending of a relationship does not create truth, it exposes it. It pulls back the curtain on what was always present, but often ignored, tolerated, or misunderstood. In a dynamic between an empath and a narcissist, there is usually a period where reality is blurred. The empath sees potential, depth, and possibility. They interpret behavior through compassion. They justify actions through understanding. They give the benefit of the doubt, believing that patience and love will eventually produce change. Meanwhile, the narcissist operates from a completely different framework, one rooted in control, validation, and self-preservation. These two perspectives cannot coexist indefinitely without tension, because they are built on entirely different foundations. So what happens is this: the relationship becomes sustained not by truth, but by perception. The empath holds on to what could be, while the narcissist continues to reinforce what serves them. And as long as that cycle continues, clarity is delayed. But once the connection begins to break, whether through distance, conflict, or complete separation, something powerful takes place. The emotional fog begins to lift. The patterns that once felt confusing start to make sense. Behaviors that were once excused become undeniable. And in that moment, the truth that was hidden beneath emotional attachment becomes visible. This is why separation is so significant. It creates space, and space allows for perspective. Without constant interaction, the empath is no longer reacting. They are observing. They begin to see the inconsistencies, the manipulation, the lack of reciprocity. They recognize how much they were giving compared to what they were receiving. And more importantly, they begin to understand that what they experienced was not a reflection of their worth, but a reflection of the other person's capacity. At the same time, the narcissist is also revealed, but in a different way. Without access to the empath's energy, their patterns become more obvious. Their need for control, their inability to sustain genuine connection, their reliance on external validation, all of it becomes clearer, not just to others, but eventually to themselves as well. Because when the environment that supported their behavior is removed, their true nature is no longer masked. Now here is the critical insight. Revelation is not comfortable, but it is necessary. Because you cannot change what you refuse to see. And many people remain stuck not because they lack strength, but because they lack clarity. They are trying to solve a problem they have not fully defined. But once truth is revealed, the path forward becomes clearer. For the empath, this revelation can be both painful and empowering. Painful because it requires accepting that the relationship was not what they believed it to be. Empowering because it provides the understanding needed to break the cycle. And this is where growth begins. Because once you see clearly, you can no longer return to blindness without choosing it. Awareness creates responsibility. It forces you to make decisions that align with truth rather than emotion. It challenges you to evaluate your patterns, your boundaries, and your sense of self. You begin to ask deeper questions. Why did I tolerate what I knew was not right? Why did I continue to give when I was not receiving? What was I seeking that kept me connected to something that was draining me? And these questions are not meant to produce guilt. They are meant to produce growth. Because the goal is not to assign blame, but to gain understanding. At the same time, it is important to recognize that revelation is not only about seeing the other person clearly, it is also about seeing yourself clearly. Your strengths, your vulnerabilities, your tendencies, and your potential. Because every experience, no matter how difficult, carries within it an opportunity for transformation. And transformation requires honesty. Honesty about what happened. Honesty about what was ignored. And honesty about what must change moving forward. When you embrace that honesty, you reclaim your power. Because you are no longer defined by the experience. You are defined by how you respond to it. So the breaking of that connection is not simply an ending. It is an unveiling. It is the moment where illusion is replaced with truth, where confusion is replaced with clarity, and where emotional attachment is replaced with understanding. And once that truth is seen, it becomes a foundation, not for returning to what was, but for building something better. Because you cannot build a healthy future on a misunderstood past, but you can build a powerful future on a clearly understood one. Pain has often been misunderstood because people interpret it as an enemy rather than a messenger. When emotional hurt enters your life, especially after a deep and draining relationship, your first instinct may be to escape it, suppress it, or even deny it. But pain does not arrive without purpose. It carries information, it carries awareness, and most importantly, it carries direction. If you ignore it, you repeat the cycle. If you understand it, you break free from it. When an empath experiences the breaking of a connection with a narcissistic individual, the pain can feel overwhelming. There is confusion because the empath invested sincerely. There is disappointment because expectations were built on hope. And there is emotional exhaustion because so much energy was given without equal return. But within that pain lies a critical truth. It is revealing what was tolerated, what was overlooked, and what must now be corrected. Pain exposes patterns. It brings to the surface the moments you ignored your intuition, the times you justified unhealthy behavior, and the instances where you chose to give more than was sustainable. It does not do this to shame you, it does this to awaken you. Because awareness is the first step toward transformation. You cannot change what you refuse to see. There is also a deeper function of pain. It separates illusion from reality. In many situations, especially those involving manipulation, the relationship may have been sustained by an idea rather than truth. The empath often holds on to potential, believing in what the other person could become, rather than accepting who they consistently are. When the connection breaks, pain strips away that illusion. It forces you to confront reality as it is, not as you hoped it would be. This confrontation is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Because growth cannot occur in denial. It can only occur in truth. Another important dimension of pain is that it redirects your focus inward. For a long time, your attention may have been centered on the other person, understanding them, supporting them, trying to fix what was broken within them. But pain interrupts that outward focus and brings your attention back to yourself. It asks questions that you may have avoided. Why did you stay? What did you accept? What were you afraid of losing? What part of your identity became tied to that connection? These are not easy questions, but they are powerful ones. Because the answers reveal not just what happened in the relationship, but what needs to be strengthened within you. Pain also teaches boundaries in a way that comfort never can. When everything feels easy, there is little motivation to evaluate limits. But when you experience emotional depletion, you begin to recognize the importance of protecting your energy. You begin to understand that not every situation deserves your empathy, not every person deserves your access, and not every relationship deserves your effort. This is where transformation begins, not in avoiding pain, but in applying its lessons. However, there is a critical distinction that must be made. Pain is a signal, but it is not meant to become your identity. Some people experience hurt and remain there, allowing it to define their perspective, their behavior, and their future relationships. They become guarded, distant, and closed off. But that is not growth, that is stagnation. The purpose of pain is to guide you forward, not to hold you in place. So the question becomes, what will you do with what you feel? You can allow it to make you bitter, or you can allow it to make you wiser. You can allow it to create fear, or you can allow it to build discernment. You can allow it to close your heart, or you can allow it to refine how you use it. Because the goal is not to stop caring. The goal is to care with clarity. As you process the pain, you begin to reclaim your power. You realize that your value was never determined by how someone treated you. You understand that your capacity to love is not a weakness, but it must be directed with wisdom. And you begin to see that what felt like loss was actually a form of release. Release from imbalance, from confusion, from a cycle that could not sustain your well-being. Over time, the intensity of the pain decreases, but the lessons remain. And those lessons become the foundation for a new way of living. You become more aware, more intentional, and more aligned with your own needs and purpose. You stop ignoring red flags. You stop overextending yourself to prove your worth. You stop accepting less than what is healthy and reciprocal. And most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself in order to keep others. This is the transformation that pain is designed to produce. It is not there to break you. It is there to rebuild you, stronger, wiser, and more grounded than before. So when you feel it, do not rush to escape it. Listen to it. Learn from it. Allow it to show you what needs to change. Because within that discomfort is the blueprint for your next level of growth. And once you understand that pain loses its power to control you and becomes a tool that empowers you. Restoration does not begin with another person. It begins with a decision. A decision to pause, to reflect, and to confront the most important relationship you will ever have, the one you have with yourself. Many people attempt to heal by replacing what they lost, but replacement is not restoration. You cannot rebuild your life by filling empty spaces with new distractions. True restoration requires understanding, and understanding begins with identity. When a person has spent a significant amount of time giving, adapting, and adjusting themselves to meet someone else's expectations, they often lose clarity about who they truly are. Their sense of worth becomes tied to how much they are needed, how much they can fix, or how much they can endure. And when that dynamic ends, it leaves behind confusion, not because they have no value, but because they have forgotten how to define it independently. This is why self-understanding is not optional, it is essential. You must take the time to rediscover your values, your boundaries, your desires, and your purpose. Not what you tolerated, not what you accepted, not what you adjusted to, but what genuinely aligns with who you are meant to be. Because without this clarity, you risk repeating the same patterns in different forms. Self-understanding requires honesty. It requires you to ask difficult questions and be willing to accept truthful answers. Why did you stay longer than you should have? Why did you ignore certain signs? Why did you prioritize someone else's needs above your own well-being? These questions are not meant to produce guilt. They are meant to produce awareness. And awareness is the foundation of growth. There is also a need to separate your identity from your experience. What happened to you is not who you are. The role you played in a dysfunctional dynamic does not define your entire character. You may have overgiven, but that does not mean you are weak. You may have been hurt, but that does not mean you are broken. These experiences are chapters, not conclusions. And when you begin to see them as lessons rather than labels, you regain control over your narrative. Another important aspect of restoration is reconnecting with your internal voice. During unhealthy relationships, people often silence their intuition in order to maintain peace or avoid conflict. They ignore discomfort, overlook inconsistencies, and suppress their instincts. Over time, this creates a disconnect between what they feel and what they allow. Restoration requires rebuilding that trust within yourself. You must learn to listen again, to recognize when something feels right and when it does not, to honor your emotions without allowing them to control you. Because your internal guidance system is one of your greatest assets, but it only functions effectively when you respect it. As you grow in self-understanding, your standards begin to change. You no longer accept behavior simply because it is familiar. You begin to evaluate it based on whether it aligns with your values. This shift is critical because it moves you from reacting to life to intentionally shaping it. You also begin to understand that your worth is not something that needs to be proven. It is something that needs to be recognized. And once you recognize it, your decisions start to reflect it. You become more selective with your time, your energy, and your relationships. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. Restoration is not about becoming someone new. It is about returning to who you were before you compromised yourself. It is about removing what was never meant to define you and strengthening what has always been within you. This process takes time, patience, and consistency, but it is necessary. You cannot rush clarity. You cannot force healing, but you can commit to the process. And as you do, something remarkable happens. You begin to feel grounded again. Your thoughts become clearer. Your emotions become more stable. Your decisions become more intentional. And your life begins to move in a direction that reflects who you truly are, not who you were trying to be for someone else. This is what restoration looks like. Not dramatic, not instant, but steady and real. It is built through daily choices to understand yourself, respect yourself, and align your life with that understanding. Because in the end, the goal is not just to recover from what you experienced. It is to grow beyond it. Growth is not something that happens by accident. It is the result of intentional decisions made consistently over time. Many people desire healing, clarity, and peace, but few are willing to establish the discipline required to sustain them. After experiencing a relationship that drained your energy and distorted your sense of self, it becomes essential to understand that moving forward is not just about distance from a person. It is about alignment within yourself. You cannot step into a new level of life carrying the same lack of boundaries that allowed the previous imbalance. Boundaries are not walls built out of fear. They are structures built out of wisdom. They define what is acceptable, what is not, and what you will no longer negotiate. Without them, you become accessible to everything. And when you are accessible to everything, you eventually become depleted by anything. Clarity is the foundation of boundaries. If you do not know what you stand for, you will fall for what opposes you. Many people leave harmful situations but remain internally confused. And that confusion leads them back into similar patterns, just with different faces. This is why growth demands reflection. You must examine not only what happened, but why you tolerated it, why you ignored certain signs, and why you compromised parts of yourself to maintain a connection that was not sustaining you. This is not about self-blame, it is about self-awareness. Because awareness is the beginning of transformation. When you become aware, you begin to recognize patterns. You begin to see how overgiving without reciprocation leads to imbalance. You begin to understand how avoiding confrontation allows dysfunction to grow. And most importantly, you begin to realize that your desire to help, fix, or save someone should never come at the cost of losing yourself. Growth, therefore, requires discipline. Not just emotional discipline, but mental and behavioral discipline. It requires you to say no when your instinct is to say yes. It requires you to walk away when your emotions are telling you to stay. It requires you to choose long-term peace over short-term comfort. And this is where alignment becomes critical. Alignment means your thoughts, your decisions, and your actions are working together in harmony with your purpose. It means you are no longer acting out of fear, loneliness, or the need for validation, but out of understanding and intention. When you are aligned, you do not chase what drains you. You attract what reflects your values. But alignment also requires patience. You cannot rush into new connections simply to fill the void left behind. Emptiness is not always something to escape. Sometimes it is something to explore. Because in that space, you rediscover who you are without external influence. You reconnect with your desires, your standards, and your vision for your life. And once you establish that internal stability, your external choices begin to change. You no longer entertain inconsistency. You no longer excuse disrespect. You no longer overlook what disturbs your peace. Because you understand that every decision you make either protects your future or compromises it. This level of growth also changes how you perceive relationships. You stop seeing them as places where you must prove your worth, and you begin to see them as spaces where your worth should be recognized and respected. You stop overextending to maintain connection, and you start evaluating whether the connection itself is healthy and balanced. And if it is not, you have the strength to walk away, not out of anger, but out of clarity. That is true power, not the power to control others, but the power to govern yourself. Because at the end of the day, you are responsible for what you allow, what you tolerate, and what you accept into your life. Growth requires you to take ownership of that responsibility without excuses. It also requires consistency. You cannot set boundaries once and expect lasting change. You must reinforce them through your actions repeatedly until they become a natural part of how you live. People will test them, situations will challenge them, and your own emotions may try to weaken them. But consistency is what transforms principles into lifestyle. And as you continue in this process, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to feel lighter, more focused, more grounded. Not because life has become easier, but because you have become stronger and more aligned. You begin to attract healthier connections, not because you are searching for them desperately, but because you are no longer available for anything less. Your standards rise, your awareness sharpens, and your presence becomes more intentional. This is what growth looks like. It is not loud, it is not rushed, and it is not superficial. It is steady, deliberate, and deeply transformative. So understand this clearly. Moving forward is not about forgetting the past. It is about learning from it. It is about taking the lessons, applying the wisdom, and ensuring that what once broke you now builds you. Because when you align yourself with truth, discipline, and purpose, you do not just recover, you evolve.